There's a mental habit most people repeat every single day, and Edgar Cayce warned it quietly shapes the outcome of their lives. He called it synchronicity, but not the kind you've heard about, not coincidences, not signs from the universe, something far more unsettling. Cayce believed that what we call random alignment is actually the echo of a pattern we created, unconsciously, through repetition of thought. Scientists are now seeing correlations between habitual neural activity and the clustering of seemingly unrelated external events, and the data doesn't comfort anyone looking for randomness. If you're watching this, you've already felt it. Subscribe quietly. You'll want to remember this. Most people think synchronicity is about noticing. Cayce said it's about construction. He described it in readings spanning 4 decades, and his explanation never wavered. You don't attract what you want, you materialize what you expect. The difference is everything. Expectation, he said, is a form of continuous inner speech, a loop that doesn't require belief or emotion, only repetition. It runs below awareness. It hums in the background of your day, and it builds, brick by brick, the circumstances you'll later call coincidence. Neuroscientists studying predictive coding have found that the brain doesn't passively observe reality. It generates a model of what it expects to encounter and then fits incoming data into that model. When the data matches, we experience it as confirmation. When it doesn't, the brain often discards it. Cayce knew this in 1932. He phrased it differently. He said the mind is a builder, and what it builds in silence becomes loudest in experience. Here's the first contradiction. People who experience the most synchronicities are not the most optimistic. Studies on cognitive bias and pattern recognition show that individuals with high levels of internal narrative repetition, regardless of emotional tone, report more frequent experiences of meaningful coincidence. It's not about positivity, it's about consistency. Cayce warned that a person who silently expects betrayal will encounter it with startling regularity, not because the universe punishes them, but because their perceptual apparatus is pre-tuned to detect and engage with signals of betrayal in ambiguous social data. The expectation creates the antenna. The antenna finds the signal confirms the expectation, and the loop tightens. But then researchers found something stranger. In controlled environments where participants were primed with specific internal narratives, the timing of external events began to cluster in ways that exceeded statistical norms. Not dramatically, not magically, just slightly more than chance would predict. It's called the observer effect in quantum mechanics, but it's been replicated in social psychology, in market behavior, in medical outcomes. The act of expecting doesn't just change what you notice, it changes what you encounter. Cayce said this is because mind is not confined to the skull. It's a field. It reaches outward. It touches the edges of probability. And where it touches consistently, probability bends. Here's where it gets darker. Cayce's readings revealed that most people are completely unaware of their dominant expectation. They think they want success, love, health. But underneath, the actual expectation, the one running on repeat, is failure, rejection, illness. He called this the subconscious inclination, and he said it was formed not by trauma, but by repetition of interpretation. A child doesn't need to be abused to expect abandonment. They only need to interpret neutral events as abandonment often enough that the interpretation becomes automatic. Then the expectation becomes structural. Then synchronicity serves it. A woman in one of Cayce's readings reported that every relationship ended the same way, always on a Thursday, always with a specific phrase. Cayce told her she was expecting the phrase. She didn't believe him. He told her to spend 30 days noticing the phrase in her inner dialogue. She found it 17 times a day, whispered silently, with no conscious origin. Now the contradiction reverses. If synchronicity is constructed by expectation, then you'd assume people could simply change their expectations and change their outcomes. But longitudinal studies on belief modification show that conscious intention has almost no impact on deep expectation patterns. You can affirm abundance every morning for a year, and if your subconscious expectation remains scarcity, synchronicity will continue to deliver scarcity with eerie precision. Cayce said, "This is why prayer often fails. Not because prayer is powerless, but because people pray against their expectations, not from them." He said the only prayer that works is the one you don't need to say, because you already expect the answer. That kind of prayer is indistinguishable from silence. It's a frequency, not a request. Satellite imaging of global communication networks shows that information doesn't spread randomly. It clusters along expectation lines, paths carved by habitual attention. A person who expects conflict will encounter news of conflict 6 times more frequently than someone with neutral expectations, even when both are exposed to the same media environment. Cayce described this in 1936 as tuning. He said you tune your consciousness the way you tune a radio, and what you hear is not what's being broadcast, but what you're calibrated to receive. Magnetic resonance imaging of people reporting high synchronicity shows increased activity in the default mode network, the brain's background hum, the part that narrates your life when you're not paying attention. It's always on, it's always expecting, and it's always building. But here's the deepest reversal. Cayce said, synchronicity is not neutral. It's not a tool you can use for good or bad. It's a mirror of your inner structure, and if that structure is unconscious, the mirror reflects what you don't want to see. A man in Cayce's files reported that every time he tried to start a business, a specific obstacle appeared, always in the 3rd month, always involving a legal issue. Cayce told him the obstacle was his expectation of paternal rejection, formed at age 7, now playing out in every authority structure he encountered. The man didn't believe it. He tried again. Same obstacle, same timing, same emotional texture. He finally examined the expectation. He found it wasn't just a thought, it was a sensation, a tightness in his chest every time he imagined success. That tightness was the expectation, and it was louder than any affirmation. Deep ocean sensors monitoring electromagnetic field variations have recorded anomalies that correlate with concentrated human expectation during global events. When millions of people expect disaster, field coherence drops. When millions expect resolution, it stabilizes. Cayce said this is because expectation is a form of energy, and energy doesn't stay local. It radiates, it overlaps, it interferes with other fields. Synchronicity in this model is not personal magic. It's the interference pattern of overlapping expectations, yours and everyone else's, colliding in the space where mind touches matter. You're not attracting your reality. You're collaborating with a field of expectations, most of them unconscious, most of them inherited, most of them unexamined. Here's the contradiction that breaks the system. If synchronicity reflects unconscious expectation, and unconscious expectation is formed by repetition of interpretation, then every synchronicity you experience is also teaching you to expect more of the same. It's a closed loop. A person who expects betrayal experiences betrayal, interprets ambiguous events as betrayal, reinforces the expectation of betrayal, and synchronicity delivers more betrayal. Cayce said the only way out is to interrupt the interpretation, not the expectation. He said, you can't will yourself into a new expectation, but you can notice the interpretation that feeds it and choose not to repeat it. That choice, sustained over time, is the only thing powerful enough to shift the field. He called it watchfulness. Modern psychology calls it metacognition. Either way, it's the act of watching yourself expect, without trying to change it, until the expectation exhausts itself from lack of reinforcement. Glacial ice core samples reveal that atmospheric composition shifts slightly during periods of collective human expectation change, such as the years following major wars or pandemics. The shifts are microscopic, but they're measurable, and they correlate with documented changes in birth rates, migration patterns, economic behavior. Cayce said, this is because expectation doesn't just influence individual lives, it influences the conditions that make life possible. He said humanity is not at the mercy of external forces, but it is at the mercy of its own unexamined expectations, which collectively shape climate, conflict, and coherence. Synchronicity, in this reading, is both personal and planetary. The coincidence you experience today is a ripple in the same field that produces droughts, alliances, extinctions. Now the final contradiction. If synchronicity is constructed by expectation, and expectation is formed by interpretation, and interpretation is formed by early experience, then synchronicity is not random, but it's also not chosen. It's inherited. Cayce said most people live their entire lives inside an expectation they didn't build, expecting outcomes they don't want, interpreting events through a lens they didn't select, and calling the result fate. He said this is the true tragedy, not suffering, but unconsciousness of cause. A woman in one of his readings asked why her child kept getting sick. He told her the child was mirroring her expectation of fragility, formed during her own childhood illness. She didn't believe him. He told her to stop interpreting every cough as the beginning of catastrophe. She did. The child's health stabilized within 3 months. The illness wasn't fake. The expectation was structural. And structure, when interrupted, dissolves. Neurological studies on children raised in environments of high interpretive consistency, where caregivers respond to ambiguous events with the same emotional tone repeatedly, show that those children develop tighter predictive models, which means they experience higher rates of synchronicity in adulthood. But the synchronicity serves the model, not the person. Cayce said, this is why generational patterns persist, not because of genetics or karma, but because interpretation is taught, and interpretation forms expectation, and expectation constructs synchronicity. He said a family that expects scarcity will encounter scarcity in every generation, not because they're cursed, but because the interpretation of scarcity has been handed down like a language, spoken silently, reinforced by every meal, every conversation, every unspoken fear. Here's where the data fractures. Some individuals report that after years of synchronicity serving a negative expectation, the pattern suddenly reverses without conscious intervention, and synchronicity begins delivering positive outcomes. Cayce said this happens when the subconscious exhausts the pattern, when repetition finally becomes so obvious that even the unconscious mind can't ignore it. He called it the breaking point, and he said it's not something you can force. It arrives when you stop trying to change the expectation and simply observe it without judgment, without resistance, without hope. That observation, he said, is a form of light, and light dissolves structure. It doesn't replace it with a better structure. It reveals the space where structure was never necessary. Magnetic anomalies recorded near individuals reporting sudden synchronicity reversals show temporary spikes in local field coherence, as if the person's internal field briefly stabilizes before reorganizing. Cayce said this is the moment of alignment, when expectation and reality momentarily match, not because reality bent, but because expectation released. He said most people never experience it because they're too afraid of the silence that comes after. The silence is not emptiness. It's the field before expectation shapes it. It's the moment where synchronicity pauses, waiting to see what you'll build next. And if you build nothing, if you simply wait, synchronicity doesn't disappear. It just stops reflecting the past. But here's the part Cayce never explained in full. If synchronicity is the echo of expectation, and expectation can exhaust itself through observation, then what happens to the people who expected nothing? The ones who never formed a dominant expectation, who lived in pure reaction, who interpreted every event as isolated, unconnected, meaningless. Cayce's files contain 12 cases of individuals reporting zero synchronicity over decades, and in every case, the person described a feeling of invisibility, as if they existed outside the field entirely. Cayce said these were the truly lost ones, not because they expected suffering, but because they expected nothing, and nothing is what they received. He said expectation is not optional. The mind builds whether you guide it or not, and if you refuse to guide it, it builds randomly, chaotically, and synchronicity reflects that chaos back to you as a life that never coheres. Peer-reviewed research on existential isolation shows that individuals who report low meaning-making activity also report fewer experiences of coincidence, fewer social connections, and shorter lifespans. Cayce said, "This is not because meaning is real, but because meaning is the structure through which expectation operates, and without structure, expectation collapses into noise." He said the universe doesn't care what you expect, but it responds to coherence, and coherence requires repetition. Even a negative expectation is better than none, because at least it builds something. At least it participates in the field. At least it creates an echo. The people who expect nothing hear nothing, and eventually, they fade. So here's the question Cayce left unanswered. If synchronicity reflects expectation, and expectation is unconscious, and the unconscious is shaped by early interpretation, and interpretation is learned, then who taught the teachers? Who handed down the first expectation? Where did the original interpretation come from? Cayce hinted that it's older than this life, that expectation carries across lifetimes, that synchronicity is not just the echo of your thoughts, but the echo of every thought you've ever had, across every version of yourself. He said the soul is a cumulative builder, and what you're experiencing now is the sum of every expectation you've ever formed in this life and before. If that's true, then synchronicity isn't a tool for manifestation. It's a record. It's a transcript of your soul's assumptions, playing out in real time, offering you the only evidence you'll ever have of what you actually believe. Satellite data from global positioning systems show that individuals who travel frequently, who change environments rapidly, report fewer stable synchronicity patterns, as if the field can't keep up with the movement. Cayce said this is because synchronicity requires resonance, and resonance requires stillness. He said people who run from their expectations don't escape them, they just dilute the echo, making it harder to hear, but no less present. He said the fastest way to change your synchronicity is to stop moving, stop trying, stop interpreting, and simply watch what appears when you hold still long enough for the field to catch up to you. But the final contradiction is the cruelest. Cayce said that even if you identify your expectation, even if you observe it without judgment, even if you allow it to exhaust itself, there's no guarantee the new expectation will be better. He said the mind is a builder, but it's not inherently wise. It builds what it's trained to build, and if it's trained on fear, it will build fear even when fear is no longer necessary. He said the only way to build something different is to expect something different, but you can't expect something different until you've seen evidence of it, and you can't see evidence of it until synchronicity delivers it, and synchronicity won't deliver it until you expect it. It's a loop with no clear entry point. He said the entry point is grace, and grace is not something you create. It's something you notice was always there, hidden in the space between expectations, waiting for you to stop building long enough to see it. And the last thing he said, in a reading given 3 weeks before his death, was that synchronicity is not about getting what you want. It's about realizing you've been getting what you expected all along, and that realization is the only freedom you'll ever need. The man who asked the question never came back.